Hey there, fellow FileMaker learners. You are here to learn more about FileMaker Pro. My name is Matt Petrowski, and in today's video, we're taking a look at field options. You're going to join me on my desktop. We're going to do that in 1 second. All right, so here we are in our FileMaker Pro. Let's switch to this file right here. If you're going to want to follow along with this particular episode, we are talking about field options, and knowing about FileMaker's field options will definitely help you get your database to store and keep the data the way that you want to keep it. So here's what I did. I went up to the File menu, and then I chose this option of a new solution. You can do the same, and I just called mine Field Options. You can call yours whatever you want to call it, but Field Options made sense to me because we're learning about field options. So let's dive into those field options. Now, the first thing that's going to come up when you create your new file is this dialog right here, right off the bat. We always see the Manage Database, and we are going to make this as easy as possible on ourselves because the field options dialog, unless you're dealing with a foreign language, in this case, Hiragana, or however you pronounce that. Sorry, those of you that are Japanese, if you're watching this, you also speak English. There's pretty much three options. The first one we're going to type in a field is auto enter. And I'm just going to type in auto enter and I'm going to create that field. You can do the same. The next one that I'm going to create is validation. And then I'm going to hit return and create that one. And the final one I'm going to create is storage. So ultimately all we're doing is we're just creating three fields here in order to go through the three primary options that you have for fields. Now, these are the overarching options, but within those, you have all kinds of different sub-options, as we will see. So the first one, auto enter, is going to be one of the most empowering options that you have for making data do what you want it to do. Because believe me, you can sort of think of this as the first rule of designing a database. Don't trust your users. And that's because, given the opportunity, users will enter all kinds of random things into fields when you think the field name is pretty obvious. Put in the phone number, put in your first name, put in your last name. Things can always go completely awry. So we're going to solve that problem, or those problems, with auto enter. So again, options on fields are really easy to access. You simply double click on the actual field, or you click on the options button down at the bottom. Either way, doesn't matter. Double click and the options will come up. And as I mentioned, they are three primary areas. They are auto enter, validation, and then storage. Now again, the Hiragana is if you are dealing with that particular item. I'm not going to be going over that. I don't deal with Japanese text. If you do, I'm going to assume that you know what this actually applies to. I've never used it. My apologies. I try to know everything about FileMaker, but you just can't when you don't deal with everything. All right, so some of these are really simple, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. It doesn't make sense to spend a lot of time. They're pretty obvious. Check this box if you automatically want this particular field to have the creation date. Now remember, I created a text field, so in this case it wouldn't match up. So it's pretty straightforward. If you're going to choose creation date, choose a date. If it's a time, make the field a time. If it's a timestamp, make it a timestamp. Otherwise, you have the options of name and account name. Now let's distinguish between these two. The name is actually coming, this is a holdover from FileMaker years long ago, that this is the name that we saw in the very first video in the previous segment of this series about settings, and that is the name. Typically, you're going to choose account name because the account name is what the user is actually logging in with. And that would apply in this situation for this text field. Likewise, we have the same thing for modification. Date, timestamp, name, account name. Don't need to spend a whole lot of time. All right, now in a previous video, just before this, it may have been yesterday, I mentioned this serial number. If you are a long-time FileMaker developer and you've been working with FileMaker for a long time, you probably have this option set. As a new FileMaker learner, if you're just starting out to build your database, you may find videos here on YouTube and other places that when they start to structure a FileMaker database, they suggest using a serial number. I'm going to suggest please don't check this box. Reason being, serial numbers in FileMaker, while they're very, very simple, do not lend themselves to today's modern computing environment, and that is primarily because of mobile. Mobile came around, and what we had was these devices that we can take out, and they're disconnected. And when you have disconnected devices, what happens is everybody who's creating a new record, if you have two databases, and let's say you put them on two different iPads using FileMaker Go, and you sent two people out into the field to go collect survey data. If you use a serial number, and you start both of them at 1, they're both creating sets of 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s. When you try to bring that data together, you have a conflict, and that is a big problem. So the world of mobile introduced, or it actually existed before mobile, a notion of a UUID. It stands for a unique identifier. Look it up on Wikipedia. I don't know what the D stands for, but it is basically a primary key that is absolutely unique. And we are going to use FileMaker's calculation dialog box right when we get down here to this option in order to do so. So please don't choose serial number. If you already have a database that has a serial number, it's not a problem. You're probably already familiar with some of the pains and aches that come with this. If you're doing a database upgrade process, you develop a database separate from the one that people are using, and then you want to put all of the old data into the new database. One of the hassles that you have with serial numbers is you have to make sure and go in and actually update this value to whatever the next value should be. So if it's 10,000, you have to make sure that you set it to 10,001, because in the copy of the database, the new database with the new features, if this is set at 1, you're going to start to create duplicate records. Now we'll look at solving that problem with validation, but again, serial number, I just advise that you don't do it. We'll see the calculated value that we can use for that. All right, now this option I really haven't ever used a whole lot, and I always find options and I like to think about what could I do with this option. It would be interesting to find out what I could do with a value from last visited record, but I can say I've probably used this less than 0.001% in my FileMaker career. Now here is something that is directly equivalent. The data option versus the calculated value, which I didn't want that dialog to come up, but I checked it. They're almost the same, only in the sense of a literal value. So this data option here, again, is a holdover from older years, previous years of FileMaker, where you would put in an actual value. For example, I want this particular text field to always default to have the value yes. Well, please don't get confused. This is old FileMaker that's here just because FileMaker keeps moving the legacy forward. It keeps bringing things forward. It doesn't want to break older solutions. But putting yes here is the exact same thing as checking this box and just typing in yes. There's really functionally no difference between the two. So if you're a new FileMaker learner, I would suggest that you just always choose the calculated option. If you want to go about it and sort of say, I want to be lazy about it, go ahead and check data and just type in yes. But recognize that you're doing the exact same thing by just putting in a literal string of yes into the calculated option. Now the advantage to the calculated option is, ta-da, we get access to the calculation dialog box and everything with regards to context and what's going on. So what can you auto-enter into an auto-enter? Anything that the calculation dialog box can do. Now, one of the most interesting things about an auto-enter on a field is that there's one function in particular that's very useful, and it's called self. So that means whatever contents are put into this field itself, then you get to do whatever you want to it. So as a matter of practice, or as a matter of an example here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select over here and choose some of, let me shrink this dialog. I can't shrink it too much. I'll choose over here, let's look at all functions grouped. We'll look at text formatting. This is where we could apply all kinds of text formatting. It's a text function, my fault, text parsing function. Let's scroll down and look for the P's where we have proper. Now, FileMaker uses the name proper. That's when I'm going to have a value, say, for example, I'm a lazy user, and I just type in lowercase because I'm used to doing that on web forms. But what I really want it to read is MATT with a proper case. Just be aware that if you have names that are like O'Keefe, that basically it's going to do this and change it to O'Keefe, which may not be the intended result. So I'm just going to put that on this particular field just for fun. You also have the upper, the lower. So if I typed in UPP, it's going to give me upper. If I type in LOWER, it's going to give me lower. This is the simplest of examples of what you can do. So we will leave that on this particular field. Now, these key fields that I keep talking about, what you would simply do is put in get UUID. And there are variations on this. You can create a custom function. A UUID field actually comes out like a string where it will include letters and numbers at the same time. Now, in super advanced FileMaker development, this can be considered a little bit of something that can cause you micro impact in terms of performance. But if it's a big database used by a lot of people concurrently, then typically a pure number in terms of a UUID is going to be much faster when you're dealing with a lot of data. But FileMaker's get UUID currently, it returns what would be a text string. So make sure that your primary key is a text string if you're going to use get UUID, and this is what you would use for a primary key. If you want to use a number version, there are custom functions out there which will either work with this or convert it or make a variant that is a pure number. So if you want to get the most amount of performance out of FileMaker, you're going to need to look for those custom functions. All right. The one absolutely awesome setting on this whole dialog box is this one right here. Do not replace existing value in a field, if any. This one option allows you to basically say, if I have this checked and this is checked, it means that the very first time that this calculation of proper self is going to evaluate, that means that first time it happens, the first time data is put into the field, that's the only time it's going to happen. It will not happen ever again. So if I typed in MATT, all lowercase, and then it proper cased that, if I go back into the field, and I suggest you do this, and then type lowercase MATT again, it won't fire. It has done it the first time, that's it. If I want it to always auto-enter continuously, I have to uncheck this box. And this is where you get all of your power with auto-enter, because you're going to be able to actually say, every time that a user types in something on this field or other fields, you want to make sure that that calculation triggers on that data. Now, looked up value, that one we're probably using, I'd say on average, less than 10% of the time. And it really depends on the database and how it's used. Now, looked up value, the best use case or example for that is, let's say you have a inventory database or an invoicing database, and you've got line items. So you have a product called a widget. And over the course of time, obviously that price is going to change. Let's say it goes from $2 to $3 to $5. You don't want to use a calculated value that automatically auto-enters a recalculated value, because an invoice that was done in 2000 where the price of the widget was $2 is now no longer $5, because if you make any changes on the invoice or in the line items table or wherever this data is stored, and you are using a calculated value, it'll go get the more recent one of $5. So any type of data where you know that you want that data to just be pulled into a field from another table, that's when you're typically going to use a looked up value. I think of this as a historical setting, a historical value from data past. And so that's where you'll be using a lookup. And you'll have to use that through a relationship. And finally, down at the bottom, we have the prohibit modification. This is the one option that you are typically going to set on any fields that you also set the auto creation or the modification. And that's because you don't want users to be able to change when a record was created or when a record was actually modified. And definitely, if you're using a calculated value and you're using a UUID, you do not want to allow modifications. You strictly want to keep control over that field. So this basically means that in the user interface, now this is a key distinction, the prohibit modification of value during data entry only applies to the user while the user is using the database and only if the field is exposed on the layout. If the field is not exposed, you can still use FileMaker's scripting and actually overwrite the data in that field. Scripting sort of is like the king of everything. You can modify fields despite a lot of the settings in this dialog box. All right, so we are going to, on this one, I didn't want prohibit. I'm going to turn on calculated, leave it at proper, and say OK. And we're going to move on to the validation. All right, now the validation is one of the areas that I had the most difficulty with when I was first learning FileMaker. And that is because the validation itself, at least the calculated validation, is a little bit confusing. The rest of the validation settings here are pretty straightforward. So let's go over those. I'm going to leave this section up at the top until the end of when I discuss all of the individual parts, and we'll talk about what the impacts of this are. First off, all of these settings are pretty straightforward. When you read them, they make sense. I can require that this field is a strict data type, which in this case, I have to think about it, doesn't really make sense. I've got this on a text field. I can strictly require that it's numeric. I can require that it is a 4-digit year date instead of entering just like 17 or 18, and a time of day. Basically, all you need to do is you're going to correlate these against whatever the field type is. Now, if the user cannot leave the field empty, meaning this record will not be accepted with this field having an empty value, then you check that box right there. And FileMaker will say, sorry, you need to have a value before I'm going to commit this data. Same with unique, same with existing. Now, unique is going to apply when you are using that UUID. Here's a point of contention for some developers. If you're never exposing your primary key, which typically you don't want to, very rarely will you expose your primary key because it's just a long string that doesn't make sense to anybody but you as the developer. Some developers do not like to put this on. The reason being is that FileMaker, when you select any of these options within the validations, FileMaker has to do something. It has to go check against the index to make sure that this particular value isn't already being used. And that's an extra step that has to be taken in terms of committing the record. If you know as the developer that you've never exposed the primary key or that particular value, and you trust FileMaker's behavior over in the auto enter that pretty much every time you're going to get a unique key, which you are, then you can pretty much safely assume that you don't need to necessarily check this unique value. Now, if you're creating, let's say, a database that would be something like Twitter, which you couldn't, but let's say you would, in that world, there can only ever be one username that is that name. You can't have two Dans or two Matts or there would be a conflict. So in that regard, if you're creating a system where users choose their own username, you would have to choose the unique option. So that's just a little bit of advice about the unique. Likewise, if it already is a value that's in the database, you can choose that it must be an existing value. Member of value list, that makes pretty much sense. You're going to have a value list, you're going to create that, and then this value has to be a member of that value list. Within a range, if it's in between 1 and 100, then FileMaker is basically going to do that for you. And here we get to my favorite of all of them, and that is the validated by calculation. Now here's the interesting thing about FileMaker. You find this on conditional formatting as well. All of these options above, internally, you can pretty much write a calculation that would be the exact same as choosing one of these options. So this range that we just looked at, if it needs to be in the range of 1 and 100, I can do the same thing in FileMaker's calculation, or it's validated by calculation. But the validated by calculation gives us all the power to FileMaker's calculation engine yet again, which this is where you get all of the power over your validation. So we're going to put a validation on this, and I'm going to explain how this works, because this is what I was confused. When is the content in a field valid? It's valid when it meets what you put into the actual calculation. So a field is valid when it's true in relation to what we put in. So what I'm going to put into this validation is I'm going to put self equals, and I'm going to put in quotes, hello world. So basically what I'm saying is in this field, you have to look at the field itself, and it's only going to be valid if it meets this calculation. And this calculation says, well, whatever's in the field, it has to be hello world. Otherwise, if it's not hello world, it's not considered valid, and you get to decide what you're going to do based on that validation. So what can you do? Well, here's one of the downsides of FileMaker's validation options by default, or one of the things that I don't necessarily like. This is where the options up at the top come into play. First, let's do the very last option outside of our calculation. We've got our maximum number of characters, which is somewhat similar to the range, but you can say the maximum number of characters that you can put in this phone field are 10. You can't have 11 because I don't want the phone number to accidentally go over. What does the user see? Well, if you want FileMaker to actually show something, then you can show this dialog box. Sorry, you can only have hello world in this field. Not filed, field. This is where you get to give a message to FileMaker, but this is what I consider one of the downsides. You don't get to control anything but the text. You don't get to control the size of the dialog box. You don't get to control how the dialog pops up, whether you actually have it within the interface, or you don't get to control the icon. It's basically just FileMaker takes control for you. And this is also where this comes into play up at the top, this validate data in this field. Now these settings, when it comes to validation, what it means is that this checkbox right here down at the bottom that says allow user to override data during data entry. This right here basically means that the field is going to be on the layout. The user has access to this field. If this is checked, then it means that your validation is telling the user, well, this isn't really what I was expecting, but you're still okay to actually change this value. If I uncheck this box, then what it's going to say is the user cannot put anything in that field except for hello world. And I suggest that you play with this. Say, okay, go over to the field, we'll type in hello world, come back into the settings, and now check this, and you'll see that the user can actually override hello world. They can put something more than hello world, which in that case would dictate a change in the wording of my dialog box here. I'm saying, sorry, you can only have hello world in this field, and that's the case right here. If I was going to check this and allow the user to actually override, I'd probably change this to, we'd like you to put hello world, but if you want to put something else, we'll let you do it. And so that's basically what that checkbox does. Now the validate always versus only data entry, this again is a user-specific setting that when the user is in the interface, if the field is visible, this option of only during data entry applies to the user. Remember, scripting is like the god of all of your data. It can do whatever it wants. You can use a script step called setField that will change data to whatever you want. It could even change data to something other than hello world. The script can. Now the user can't because that's what's controlled in the validation here, but your script can. If you want the validation to apply to your script as well, meaning I can't write a bad script, then you're going to check this option of always, meaning no matter what now, the validation on this field can only ever, according to scripting, users, any and everybody, it can only ever have hello world. And we're going to see that as we leave those settings set right there. And we'll get to storage here in just a bit. But let's take a look at our fields and see what they're doing quickly here. All right, so FileMaker added our fields. We're not going to be able to do anything with 0 records. So let's go ahead and create a new record. And we now have our proper. So now I can put in that example, and as soon as I tab, we can see that the proper actually applies to the self of the field. Now in this validation, I can try to put anything else, which I suggest you do the same. I can tab. That's okay. Tabbing will move through all of the fields until this record is committed. In fact, if I hit tab, you'll see that it'll cycle through all of the fields. I've never said, or FileMaker's never determined, I need to now actually put this into the database. In fact, this data isn't in the database just because I typed it. It's only after this record is validated, and FileMaker, or your validation says, this is okay. It's acceptable. Put it into the database. That happens whenever you do a few things. When you move to another record, that's assumed that you're going to commit the record. When you click outside of a field in FileMaker, then that also is a commit event, and there's a few other. Now I just clicked, and you can see that the dialog comes up that says, sorry, you can only have hello world in this field. That is my message, but again, like I stated, you don't get to control this little icon right here. But we will look at a future video where we'll take a look at script triggers where you actually can take control. And you're going to do that with the on record validation, or one of the script triggers that we will get to. Now, typically this dialog, when it comes up, it may have the override option, but you can see here that option is not there because we unchecked that box and did not allow the user to have anything in this field except for hello world. And you would get an error with your scripts as well, and it wouldn't consider this record valid because we set the option of always. So the only option here is to revert the record. And what does revert do? Well, it's going to take away all of the data. Meaning everything that I put in prior to that commit, it just all goes away. My mat included as well. So let's go change those options really quickly on the on the validation. We'll go to the validation settings. We'll say allow the user to override. Only do it during the data entry. And now we'll change this out. And we'll change our dialog box just to have fun. We'd like you to type hello world, comma, but you can put something else. So there we go. And we'll say okay. All right, so now we'll put in Bob, and we'll put it lowercase, and we'll do multiple words with proper. Bob Jones. And one thing you have to recognize is that it will do letters. So if I do Bob P. Jones, and I put in for my validations, you can see that the auto enter triggered right there, and it did capitalize the initial. It basically does the first letter proper of every word. And our validation is I'm Matt, if I could find that. And remember, the validation doesn't happen. It only validates on the record level. So that can be a little bit of an issue for you. In this scenario, if I wanted to actually tell the user what they needed in the field, probably a better option would have been an on-object exit on this particular field and running a script. Because a record, the validation on the record doesn't actually happen until we actually commit, which if I can go to all and any fields prior to a commit, then I'm not really catching the user at the point in time that I would hope to. So when I commit here, it says, there we go. There's the different version of that dialog box. We'd like you to type hello world, but you can put something else. And here, because of that checkbox to allow, I can say yes. But here's the kicker. If I do put in hello world, remember, as long as it meets the criteria of the calculation, everything's fine. I'll never see that dialog box. I put hello world. That's what the calculation expects. That's what's considered good. All right, so let's head into the last of our 3 options for field options, and that is storage right here. Storage, we took a look at in yesterday's video. If you didn't watch it, go ahead and check it out. It is about global fields, and storage is this option right here. We learned that you can set any of FileMaker's field types except for summary and calculation. Well, here's a good tip. An unstored calculation is almost the exact same as a global field. A global field that uses auto enter can be considered roughly the same thing as a calculation, except for the fact that an unstored calculation, we'll talk about unstored versus stored, an unstored calculation can't be changed. A global field can, and you can have auto-enter options on a global field. So you can mix and match. I can certainly check the calculated value here on the auto-enter, and still make that field a global. So remember that you can do that. Now, the one option we didn't take a look at is repeating fields, and we'll be talking about repeating fields in another video at another time, but here's where we get into indexing, and I'm going to talk about indexing in another video, but basically what FileMaker does with regards to indexing is FileMaker makes some choices for you. It starts off with none, and this checkbox of automatically create indexes as needed is checked by default on every field that you create in your FileMaker database. And if you take the time and read the information that we have right here, it tells you what's going to happen. Field value uniqueness at the cost of increased file size. So basically, it's just like a book. If a book didn't have an index, it wouldn't have the few extra pages at the end of the book. But you wouldn't be able to find anything within the book. Let's say it's a catalog. Without the index, you can't go to a smaller section of pages that will point you directly to where you want to go. It works the exact same within a database. If a field has an index turned on, then that means FileMaker, when you're looking for something using FileMaker's find mode, it can go to the index and say, where are all of the Bobs in all of these contacts that I have? Where are all of the invoices that happened in September of 2017? The index is what allows fields to tell FileMaker's search feature how to actually bring those records up. And there's a few different options that we have here. And the distinction between minimal versus all, I have to be honest, I don't know the exact distinction between them. I'm sure I could look it up. It was a long time ago. Basically, it boils down to what FileMaker does with regards to the index. Because you can have a lot of words in a particular field, FileMaker takes all of those words up to a certain limit. I don't know if it's the first 250 or 2,000. I'd have to look up FileMaker's specifications. But it takes either a portion of all of those words or I'll probably have to look that up, and we'll do a more thorough inspection of FileMaker's indexing. But I can tell you how it works. Indexing starts off at none, meaning until you actually search on a field, the field will be set to none. Because this checkbox is checked by default, the first time that you search on a field, it moves it up to probably minimal, or depending on the type of search that you do. Then if it needs more information, then it will move the indexing up to all. Now, if a field is initially set to none, which all of them are, and they are all have this option checked, if you come into the database and you uncheck this box, you're basically telling FileMaker, don't ever add an index to this particular field. When would you want to do that? Well, when there's text that you're going to store in the database, but you know you don't want users to be able to search on that text. Let's say you're creating a FileMaker database that stores web pages or XML content or something where it doesn't make sense necessarily that you would want users to search that content. You would need to come into this dialog box and intentionally uncheck this. If I'm creating a field and it's called HTML and I know I'm using FileMaker's get URL or download, one of the script steps that basically goes to a web page, grabs all the content and brings it back into FileMaker, and I don't want that to be searchable, this is the option I'm going to come check, is uncheck automatically create indexes. Now again, we'll look at the index in another video because I'm at 33 minutes now and I want to get to the questions, and I like to keep these short. But the default language you can change for the index, and we will be looking at the options that I have used in this regard. There's one in particular, and it really applies to when you're searching and how that applies. But I think I've gone through all of the areas of FileMaker's field options. The three primary: auto enter, validation, storage. Remember, you can use them in conjunction with each other in order to achieve what you want to achieve. Repeating has some interesting aspects to it, and we'll be getting into that in another video. But those are our 3 primary options out of the 4 available in field options. Now, just before I get to questions, I'd like to point out that if you are interested in more about FileMaker Pro, being able to get into FileMaker really in depth and learning about techniques, tricks, tips, all kinds of stuff, FileMaker Magazine is a website that I produce. I just did a video recently, which if this interests you, for example, this is a FileMaker database that holds just a bunch of custom functions. And I wanted users to be able to search on this particular database, and I came up with this little widget right here. It's this little, just a little magnifying glass. And when you click on it, what's really cool is it takes away those other icons and it brings up this search dialog box. And I can actually search for, let's say, sorting custom functions. But I wanted to give the user the option that if they wanted to search only for a function name, they could just click this little toggle right there. And you can see that when I did a search for sort, it came up with 71 out of 2,291 custom functions. And I wanted to be able to search on sort, and you can see that it narrowed things down to 14 out of 2,229. So if you want to learn how to do little cool features like this in your user interface, where you can do this little close but have this nice search functionality and actually be able to copy the script itself, please consider going over to my website, Filemaker Magazine. You can have a subscription there, and it is infinitely worth it. Over the life of a magazine, it's only $137 a year or $34 every 3 months, every quarter. And you get to copy and paste code, lots of time savings. You can consider that. Just go over and check out the subscribe. If you like the videos that I'm doing here on YouTube, please give me a thumbs up on the video or consider subscribing here. And now we can jump into the questions, see if we've got any of those. So I'll switch over here and see if we've got any questions that came up. All right, bygone years, universal. All right, so we've got a question down there towards the bottom, all right, over there. So as a general rule, do you recommend always using a text field with a calc versus using a calc field if possible? Excellent, excellent question. In fact, I give webinars and courses on advanced development every once in a while. And one of the biggest things that I like to teach people is regards to an unstored calculation versus an auto enter. Whenever you have an unstored calculation and you start to add a lot of those to your database, what happens is you start to accumulate a lot of debt. So let me switch over to our video there and take a look at this. So for example, I don't have an actual good example of a database that has a lot of unstored, but we will create an unstored. We'll get into naming conventions. Really good video coming up about that. We'll call this unstored, and we'll create a calculation field. Select calculation, L right there, and we will create that. Now, if this calculation, back off a little bit there, if this calculation is ultimately going to do the same thing as what we just did, if I'm going to put a proper of the, in this case, the auto enter was the field that we were referencing, and it would be, say, the first name or the last name. And I went down to this little option. Now, one thing to recognize is that calculations themselves, they also have storage options, that same tab that we saw. As I back this off and click on storage options, it's going to be a little bit different for calculations. You can see that a calculation can actually be made into a global storage, and we won't get into this, but we have a lot of the same indexing options that we saw. But this option on a calculation, meant to zoom in a little more there, of do not store calculated, this is what makes a stored calculation into an unstored calculation, which gives us real-time results. If you have a lot of these, then your FileMaker database will tend to slow down. But what's the difference between doing this right here and having a calculation result of text, as opposed to just creating a text field and using an auto-enter calculation? That's the question that HBH group just asked. Well, the difference is that if you use the auto-enter, you're not going to pay the performance penalty over the long haul of the number of unstored calculations that you accumulate, because each unstored FileMaker calculation means that you are telling FileMaker when you look at that, or when a user goes to that record, FileMaker, here's some work for you to do. All of these are unstored. Please go calculate all of them. And if the data is something that really it only changes at the point in time of data entry, an auto-enter calculation on a regular text field is going to be much better to do than an unstored calculation. And a lot of videos, when you see them out on YouTube and other places, they will just create these unstored calculations. And my advice to you is use the auto-enter on a regular field if you know that the data is only going to need to be calculated at the point of data entry. Otherwise, if it's something that you know is going to be reflected based on other pieces of data in the database that maybe users are editing, that's when you're going to use an unstored field. So excellent question, and thank you for the opportunity to explain that. Auto-enter is your friend, for sure. All right, see if we got any more questions before we wrap things up. We're at, looks like 40 minutes here, and I think that was the last question. All right. So I think that's going to give this video a wrap. Again, if you like the content that you found here on YouTube, give me the thumbs up for this particular video or any of the other videos in the series. If you have suggestions, use the comments below. By all means, you can put the comments. I get notified on my phone immediately when a comment comes in. I don't always answer them right away, but I do my best to answer them as I can, and it helps other people learn more FileMaker as well. All right, so next video will be coming up. Subscribe right here, and the next video will be coming up right here when it's produced. All right, see you later.